Welcome to From the Spectrum podcast. This is a podcast about autism. It is my goal to explain what is autism. I plan to use a mixture of scientific literature, personal experience, and opinion. With opinion, I will explain why I feel the way I do and give examples. I will provide links to various references for each episode. For each episode, we will discuss various aspects of autism. For today's episode, we will time travel a bit through the history of autism. Our goal is to understand the rates of autism. The past 30 to 40 years or so, the rates are increasing. We will cover classifications, the definitions, the symptoms or traits, the connections and the separation of schizophrenia, the DSM, and the assessment history. Remember Dr. Catherine Lord, a previous guest. And we will cover some regulations, some government regulations, including the vaccines. This is a hot spot for autism and a confusing spot. There are many strong opinions. We will cover a Bayh-Dole Act from 1980. We covered what I think and some others think is the cause of autism: light. More specifically, artificial light. Remember the differences between the sunlight and the evolution of various artificial light. Light is energy, and living organisms on Earth use sunlight for life, including humans. Remember the sun spectrum versus artificial light spectrum. Remember the lux, or luminous intensity. Remember how our body, our biology, uses various wavelengths of light. And the shift and extension of the energy source created adaptation or neuroplasticity, and that gives us autism. The extension just mentioned means we can extend the day with artificial light. The 2017 Nobel Prize in Medicine Physiology was given to circadian scientists. Living organisms follow a strict light-dark cycle since creation. We will expand somewhat from the previous episode. For today's episode, we will skip ahead from the 1880s and the power grid and start in 1911. Remember, Alzheimer's was around this time too, in 1910. Remember, we covered similarities of autism and Alzheimer's, or various dementias, and the neuroplasticity undertaking on the molecular and cellular level. In 1911, autism appears as a component, a state of schizophrenia, which remained for 40 to 50 years or so. Also, in this era, it was psychoanalyst. So, Sigmund Freud and his lineage. Freud, today, his practice does not exist much. However, the field of psychology accelerated because of him. Or, he is a contributing factor for it. In short, psychoanalysts believed a lot in immediate thoughts, dreams, and sex. Coitus sex, not gender sex. Some notes: neuroscience, and more broadly, biology, was not well understood compared to now. Of course, the nervous system wasn't understood as we understand it with the trillions of connections, the billions of cells, the feed-forward, feedback communication, and so forth. Around the same time, in the early 1900s, this research really accelerated too. So there was a lot happening. So in 1911, the Bleuler description, a scientist or researcher named maybe Eugen Bleuler. Here are some highlights from 1911, published though in 1950. These were his writings from 1911. Autism is a symptom of schizophrenia, thought to be peaks from other states, mostly called Twilight peaks or dream states. Autism could not be diagnosed because it occurs in those twilight or dream states. Remember, it's just a part of a condition. Autism was not its own thing. The book also mentions delusional states and paratic or partial paralysis. The autistic symptom begins in childhood. Okay, that makes sense. It blocks reality and unconcerned with reality. And child might play with a piece of wood and imagine it as a toy, such as a baby at one time and a house at another time. I am unsure why the author said baby and toy, meaning as these are general examples, or are these accurate from questioning and observation? Autism can comfort themselves in a crowded room as if alone. Everything that concerned others without these symptoms, that crowded room, it doesn't exist to the autistic. And it appears to be objects, not humans, making this room crowded. Autistics satisfy themselves on themselves. Remember me saying, the biology that gives us autism allows us to be comfortable within ourselves. The book thought autism was a lack of interest. That makes sense. Troubles with beginning ordered tasks or demands, including holding a pencil for a writing task. Autism prevents autistics from temptation. They are less sensitive to raillery, which is humor or teasing, banter. They are less sensitive to raillery in society. They can be stuck from previous experiences, from memory. Remember, we discussed this quite a bit. That neuroplasticity part from the learning side, making us more of who we are. This sounds accurate for 1911. This sounds accurate for autism or autistic, just being a kind of a subcategory of a larger condition. It is impossible to discriminate based on this if autism could have been a separate diagnosis. Remember, these are pulled from a book about schizophrenia. We've covered similarities, though, such as the excitation-inhibition balance or imbalance, the shared genetic implications that are known today. Obviously, these highlight shared symptoms, or we typically call it phenotype. There are a lot of symptoms or phenotypes similar. Remember from the first episode, Cluster A, personality types, the odd or eccentric, and the schizoid personality diagnosis. These are very similar. Schizoid personality even has better symptom details in the description, I think, than autism. But that doesn't cover everything. The schizoid doesn't cover the full complexity of autism. That means the symptoms are not as crude, though. They're very specific symptoms. Regardless, the book highlights autistic can be comfortable within themselves, prefer that, can become more of it from neuroplasticity. Today, it is easier to discriminate those differences with delusional states. That's schizophrenia, not autism. And this continued until around 1959. Back then, back in the 50s, and the 60s, these children were mostly institutionalized just because they were maybe retarded or different. So please consider that as well. Autism began to separate from those more severe schizophrenia symptoms. So this book, in 1911, predates Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger about one generation, 20 to 30 years, meaning the book highlights children in 1910, 1911 with these symptoms. So that's about 20 to 30 years before Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger's. This timeline fits for the previous episode with the power grid and the electricity in 1880s. However, we know autism now is very heritable. That's one thing research and others kind of do agree on. In 1923, Jean Piaget published Symbolic Thought and Infantile Thought. This book by Piaget highlights visual imagery. This is significant in autism. Remember Temple Grandin thinking in pictures. Over the next few decades, communication became a region of interest. Communication problems were more observable, more recognized, and associated with the autistic, which also fits me saying that criteria B kind of creates criteria A. The social communication and interaction problems includes the eye problems, the eye gaze, the eye contact, and the speech and language, the spoken words. In socialness, people use eye gaze to help the others to know what is important, to show them, pay attention. Eye gaze kind of helps others pay attention to each other and to the message. And the social communication problems come from this abstract thinking type, which is also involved with the eye gaze and speech and language to others, that dialogue. This is all created as a dysfunction because of those abstraction problems with abstracting, and this internalizing. This autistics prefer to be within themselves. And this is shown, this is studied through the literature from the history of autism. These are the first symptoms to show up. Children not paying attention to the outside environment. Autism, in my opinion, is more criteria B, but criteria A is easier to observe, easier for people to recognize and make sense of it. Oh, that's something's going on here. Let's explore the history of the DSM. If you receive a diagnosis in the US, it will come from the DSM. It is closely related to the ICD, which is what the majority of the world uses. Remember a previous guest on the From the Spectrum podcast, Dr. Catherine Lord. She discusses some details on the DSM, specifically the levels 1 through 3, that were included in the latest version. More in a bit, and more on Dr. Lord when we cover assessments. In the first two DSMs, DSM 1 and 2, the word autism or autistic is only mentioned one time each. In 1952, DSM 1 is released, and a diagnosis called schizophrenic reaction childhood type. So a psychotic reaction is what it refers to. Autism is referred to as a psychotic reaction. In 1968, DSM-2, a diagnosis called schizophrenia childhood type. Remember, removed from the severe symptoms in 1959, DSM-2 describes a withdrawn behavior. They use autistic with the so-called social isolation or the social withdrawal. This is becoming more accurate. In 1980, DSM-3, and finally, infantile autism. Autism has its separate and distinct diagnosis. And also added is a so-called pervasive development disorder. In 1987, DSM-3 revision includes autistic disorder. Pay attention to these dates because we're up in the 80s now, and autism is becoming its separate thing. In 1994, DSM-4, and there's a autistic disorder with 4 subcategories. So remember these timelines, 1980, 1987, and 1994. Because these are going to be crucial when we discuss the rates of autism. And finally, in 2013, DSM-5. The gates are wide open now. Autism spectrum disorder, and the 4 subcategories combined. Okay, now assessments. We discussed with Dr. Catherine Lord, the creator of 2 gold standards in autism assessment. In 1990s, late 80s to 2000 or so, to be more generous, late 80s to 2000. Remember, this was before a publisher. She was creating the ADOS in her basement and received hate mail about not getting them out fast enough. The demand now, at this time frame, is large. This was when autism was fully recognized from the DSM editions. Before this, autism assessment lacked standardization. Dr. Lord also covered this. There was no tools for autism specifically, or very limited tools. Tools lacked validity and reliability before this. Tools specific to autism were hard to come by. In the next few subsequent years, autism tools and instruments became available. The ADI, the ADOS, one called CARS, combined with various social communication questionnaires, such as a SCQ, which is also Dr. Lord, and various restricted repetitive behaviors, such as RBSR. So more tools for autism and specific tools for the social communication part and the restricted repetitive behavior part. These are only 20 to 30 years old. The original versions, of course, they got revised, but Dr. Lord mentioned they constantly need revised. Something that slows or restricts the revisions, that is if the publisher is making money on it or not. If the current edition or revision is making money, then the publisher is going to stay put. Why invest money when money is coming in? The critical information between the DSM and assessment history is this. 20 to 30 years is going to be crucial momentarily. Okay, a hotspot for the cause of autism and something that correlates strongly with the diagnosis is vaccines. Vaccines also appears large in this time frame too. I don't think vaccines are causing it. Remember the previous episode, Cause of Autism, and we reviewed Light. However, vaccines, they are a concern, and it needs reformed. That's my opinion. And here is why. Here's what you need to know. In 1980, Bayh-Dole Act was passed. Evan Bayh and Bob Dole. This act reads, Patent or Trademark Law Amendments Act is United States legislation permitting ownership by contractors of inventions arising from federal government-funded research. You ought to think about centralized medicine. Think about universities, agencies such as CDC, National Institute of Health, etc. Pharmacology being able to profit from federal funding. This is wild. This throws pharma, including vaccines, at everything. Now everything is just the profit mill. Medicine, pills, vaccines. And what does our centralized paradigm do? We prescribe and we give vaccinations like no other country. This is our paradigm. The status quo, you need to ask yourself, I want you to ask yourself, is what we're doing working? Look at any health measurement. Look at any health condition. Is what we're doing with that health condition you choose? Is it working? Think about all of the commercials for pharmacology. Medicines from Big Pharma. Think about how many of those you see. However, now think about, with vaccines, they don't have to advertise them because they are required. One, there's no need to advertise. And two, for sure sells. Ask a business how much advertisement would cost at the scales of pharmacology uses them. And on the biggest networks, how much is spent on this advertising and marketing? Remember a previous episode with the revenue. 2023, the business types with the biggest revenue for 2023. One was centralized money. Two was hospitals. And then also in the top 5 were 2 from pharmacology. Pharmacology and health and beauty. And then pharmacology wholesale. So that's the top 5 cleared profits. It's coming from these business types. So last thing on this act, this Bayh-Dole Act, or scam, or act, Research takes taxpayer money and turns it into personal profits. Then medical schools and society is suffocated with prescriptions. It's sick. Anyway, vaccines took off after this. The schedule changed drastically after Bayh-Dole Act. Right around the same time, autism rates accelerate. But people will need to consider the DSM classifications and autism being a separate or unique diagnosis. And the assessment standardization taking place. And ever since, autism rates have accelerated. Okay, the history of diagnosis, also called rates of autism or prevalence. You've read it or heard of it. Things like 1 in 36, which is extremely outdated by now, by the way. Let's look at it through the decades. And as we review the decades, remember crucial items like the classifications, the acceptance, the descriptions, the assessments. Remember the timelines associated with those items. From 1930s to 1980s, it was mostly stagnant. It exists, but not much change. Maybe 1 in tens of thousands, 1 in 10,000, or 1 in 12,000. A question could be, since it wasn't an official diagnosis until 1980, how was that diagnosis selected? Here's what the episode is all about, right here. Last episode, we covered a cause, a biological cause, with atomic explanations, and the timeline fits. It fits perfectly. Still today it fits. The changes fit, the light sources, the light exposure, the genetic implications from that, and the other health conditions. Let's explore this. Autism classification and acceptance came to the masses in 1980, medically accepted. Assessment standards came in 1990s, 1987 and 1994, and 2013, autism began to combine. Each of those years, autism had its unique classifications. There were multiple ones. Let's pause in 1980 to 1987 to 1994. Autism and the subcategories began to emerge. Now begin to see the rates of autism increase during those years. From 1980 to 1990, there was a significant increase. From 1990 to 2000, there was a sharp increase. There was a 45-degree increase on the XY graph. So basically doubling. Now add standard assessments to the classifications. Remember Dr. Lord, her work, and the podcast episode. The part that seems confusing is vaccine increases, and still today, many people are still looking at this as the cause. But autism existed before this large increase in the vaccine schedule. Autism, likely, and we heard from Dr. Lord, when she began as just an undergraduate student and just out of undergraduate, she worked with many children that had autism, but maybe not diagnosed as autism. What people want to know, what's confusing, the question is the why. Further, understanding the diagnosing rate. Was it undiagnosed back then or diagnosed as something else, which seems likely? It seems like that is reasonable. A reasonable suggestion, after 2013, and the subcategories were combined into autism spectrum. A reasonable suggestion is the evolution of the classifications and the assessments. More people going undiagnosed as well. Don't forget about the artificial light and the health implications to the cell biology, development, proliferation, differentiation, cells dividing, and the nervous system becoming a large and complex living organism and what is being implicated with that. If you are listening to the episode or listening to the podcast, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586 or email info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.